Hey, everybody. Before we get into the show today, Melvin and I would just like to tell you how you can support the show.
Don't forget to leave us a 5-star rating in iTunes, write a written review, and tell a friend.
You can follow us on social media. We're The Life of X on Facebook and Instagram, and at Life of X Podcast on Twitter. We're definitely the most active on Twitter, so you should join us. Follow us there. Retweet our tweets.
And head over to our support page at lifeofxpodcast.com.
There you are going to find several options to support the podcast. The first is audible.com. For those of you who don't know what audible.com is, it is the largest purveyor of audiobooks on the internet. I have personally been using it for years. Many of the books that we have used for the podcast can be found on Audible. If you go through our portal on our page, you will receive a free audiobook when you sign up for a monthly subscription, and they will also kick us a few dollars.
You can also support us by going through our portal to Amazon. If you do that, any purchases that you make, we'll get a small kickback.
We've also added a featured book page to the website. Any of you who are interested in actually purchasing the books that we've used, many of which are fantastic books, you can go through there, and that will route you through our Amazon portal to the Amazon page where you can purchase the books. And so, again, we get a few cents off each purchase. Additionally, we've set up a Patreon page, and for those of you who are unaware of what that is, it is a service wherein patrons can pledge a certain amount of money per episode. So every time Melvin and I release an episode, you would send us $1, $2, whatever you can. We would appreciate anything. We have goals set up. We have different tiers so that we can also reciprocate your generosity.
All your dollars help.
That's right. But again, we would just like to say that the most important thing that you can do is rate, review, and tell a friend. Help get our name out there. All right. Enjoy the show.
Thanks, guys.
Hello and welcome to the podcast. My name is Arif Jadala.
And I'm Melvin Barnes.
And that makes this The Life of X. Melvin, how you doing?
I'm doing good. Sipping on some coffee. Feeling great.
Yeah, look at us. We are out here 2 weekends in a row recording. Almost like we're actual
a rare
podcasters.
treat.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm heading off to China soon, so we've got to get these episodes knocked out.
We do. We need to get these done. Who do we have this weekend?
This weekend, we have probably my favorite person on the lineup, Bruce Lee.
Bruce Lee. And, you know, we haven't decided when we're going to release these episodes or in what order. So if it's not our first episode, you'll know that we usually completely forget to mention the book that we based our episode on until usually halfway through the first episode.
Yep.
But
wait, let's talk about the author of the book and the book. Yeah.
Well, let's shout the book out.
So the book that we used to construct this essay was Bruce Thomas's.
That's not an essay. This is a podcast.
I'm sorry, my bad. I'm so used to writing essays.
My guy.
Whatever. Bruce Thomas's Bruce Lee Fighting Spirit. So we came to this book because we were, word on the street.
We were swayed by the Amazon reviews.
Yeah. Word on the street said that this was the definitive biography, the one to go to.
You know what, though? The thing about these Amazon reviews is that in the age of Amazon, anyone can these books.
So what you're trying to say is Bruce Thomas was on there writing his own reviews.
I'm not trying to listen. We are not going to engage in the proud graduate student tradition of just disparaging an author and their hard work for an entire, usually length of a seminar. But we're not going to do it on a podcast. But I will say, in the age of Amazon, it is easy to be misled by reviews.
Well, yeah. So overall, I think the book was it was okay, but there was definitely some holes with it.
Yeah. I mean, we just finished recording last week, Steve Jobs, and, regardless of what you think of the episodes when you hear about it, we based that on Walter Isaacson's biography, and Walter Isaacson is a fantastic biographer. So, when you compare the two, there's just not a whole lot of similarity. I mean, it would be a hard act to follow a Walter Isaacson biography, but he's got a lot of passion for Bruce Lee.
He has the passion. I will say that. And I will say this too, despite the passion, he does an okay job of I would say giving a fairly honest assessment of Bruce himself.
And I agree with you. And I don't think that there are a lot of factual inaccuracies, though I think there were a few.
I'm a old school Bruce Lee head, grew up watching this stuff, and I noticed a couple of things, but I think that if you were maybe like Linda Lee, his wife, you might find more where you're like, ooh, I don't know about that.
Yeah. And the thing is too about this is that from a biography standpoint, he doesn't really seem to deal much with primary sources at all. And he seems to have a lot of opinions about the people who did and their interpretations, like other biographers and that sort of thing. And he's also very bought into the whole culture around Kung Fu that a lot of people seem to...
The traditional culture.
Right. That a lot of people seem to buy into. And what he deems the cult of Bruce Lee, I feel like, I don't know if he was including himself in that or not, but I feel like he's probably closer to it than he thinks he is.
Yeah, I think he's certainly touched on it, but I think he's more closely associated with what I'd say like traditional Kung Fu in the West, in that like once it was transplanted from China and it came here and the practitioners here, he's like grounded in Kung Fu practice in the West or, the United States and in the UK.
Yeah, a few of the things that he did that kind of grated on me, and again, I wouldn't not recommend this biography. I just don't think I would recommend it super strongly, and I would recommend it with a lot of, like, hey, just beware of these things.
Yeah. To keep in mind, this is Arif, a former practitioner of some sort of Kung Fu.
By former practitioner, he means that I did 1 semester of 1 night a week classes my first year in college.
Kent State.
That's right, go Flashes. But I was going to say some of the things that kind of grate on me about this biography is, one, there's not a lot of objectivity in terms of weeding out his own beliefs, like detaching himself from.
I see. Yeah.
So, like, he is obviously into the idea of like Qi and believes that the Dim Mak death touch is a very effective and legitimate tool. And, whatever you want to say about that stuff, I feel like when you're writing a quote unquote definitive biography of someone, you should have the wherewithal to detach yourself and understand that maybe I shouldn't talk about my personal beliefs as if they are absolute fact.
I see. Yeah, I'd have to say that's a fair assessment.
And he also, and I don't know, like, there's no rule that says you can't do this, but when writing a biography about someone, I just feel like he inserted himself quite a bit.
Yeah. So any of you guys who, after listening to the podcast, go and pick this up, be forewarned, you'll learn a lot about Bruce Lee, but you'll learn a little bit about Bruce Thomas.
Yeah, and you know what? I don't care about Bruce Thomas. I didn't pick this book up because I care about Bruce Thomas. Found out he had a successful band. And I also think that, with the benefit of hindsight, I think if someone wrote a biography of Bruce Lee now, it would probably be a lot less sensational than the early stuff. So I feel like when he published this was probably considered a lot more balanced than a lot of the stuff that had come before it.
Yeah. I think that, the 90s were still, the fever was hot. The flames were still hot. The coals were red.
Drink that coffee,
It's good coffee, man. I think for 94, it was probably a really objective account. But, 2018,
not so
a little
much.
Different.
Yeah.
Maybe Arif will take up the task of writing the next Bruce Lee biography.
Well, we both know I won't. But all those things being said, I think it's a fine book.
Also, look, and here's the thing. Don't take our word for it. Pick up the book.
Pick it up yourself.
And, you can always let us know what you think about it.
Form your own opinion. We're just the voices bouncing around between your ears.
We're just ye messengers.
That's right.
So shall we? Is it time to get into Bruce?
Let us.
All right.
Also, Melvin is going to be saying all of the names.
Nah, don't. Look.
Melvin speaks Chinese.
I speak Chinese, do a little research in China, whatnot, and Arif thinks that that's going to equip me to say all of these Chinese names. Now, I speak Mandarin Chinese, not Cantonese. So.
Okay, but you still have a better chance of getting close than I do.
Yeah. Funny anecdote. I watched all of these films growing up, and my understanding of what Chinese was Cantonese. So when I started taking Chinese classes, I was like, what is this? This doesn't even sound like Chinese, man. Yeah, so.
That's funny. I think I need to say that while I am a casual Bruce Lee fan, I have not watched all of these movies. I've seen most of them, and I'm certainly not as committed as Melvin, who has a small stack of Bruce Lee related books. I have just this book.
The man, if you don't know, he was a wonderful philosopher. And I think from a young age, like, reading his ideas, really, even to this day, they still kind of have a really important place in my life.
Yeah, they have a really important place in a lot of people's lives, which is part of the whole being a cultural icon thing. But we can definitely get into that.
All right. I guess I'll start us out.
Start us.
So Bruce Lee's parents, his father's name was Lee Hoi Chen, and he was a Hong Kong-based actor a fairly moderate success. I mean, he wasn't a nobody, but he definitely wasn't, the top billing running around Hong Kong. And his mother, her name was Grace, and she's the daughter of actually a Chinese mother, I believe from Shanghai, and a German father. So one thing that people don't always realize is that Bruce Lee had a German grandfather.
Yeah, I never realized that at all. I was just assumed that he was full Chinese.
Yeah, I mean, which is quite interesting, and the fact that he has a German grandfather will kind of come up in his story later on. But it's very interesting. I mean, and I think his German grandfather, I feel like they were Catholic.
I think they were Catholic.
Yeah, which is kind of yeah.
There's one thing too that I actually meant to ask you before we started recording, but I'm just going to ask you now. Do you know if Bruce Lee's parents were Catholic? Because it sounded like the first school that he attended was a Catholic school, and it said something about like most of the Chinese students being Catholic.
Yeah, so I mean, the thing that we have to remember is that Hong Kong had a lot of Western influence, had been under a lot of Western influence. It's a British colony at this point in time. Well, I mean, and the interesting thing about Hong Kong is, I mean, if you listen to the Brits, I'm not sure if it's the British or the Chinese understanding of it, but like Hong Kong, they often say was, in this, I think they say the same thing about Shanghai, which I think by this point, Shanghai, it's been completely debunked, but like that it was not really a happening spot before the British decided to take it. Part of the argument is like, that's why the Chinese were willing to give it up, because they were like, sure, you want Hong Kong? Take it. Like, this is nothing. And obviously exploded and grew from there. And
see, imperialism is a good thing.
That is not what you're saying. So yeah, I mean, there's a lot of Western influence, so Catholic influence, Protestant influence. But the thing is I think when those things come into that Chinese context, they're understood and kind of built up differently.
Yeah.
So it's possible that they were Catholic. They could have been devout Catholics in the way that, maybe people in the West are, but there's also a strong possibility that it was very different.
Yeah.
Maybe they observed some things, but not all things, but they were still, I mean, obviously, culturally and traditionally, they still had all of those very strong markers of, Chinese life. But he did, well, we're getting a little bit ahead of ourselves. So
people come to us for the tangents, Melvin.
These two, Chen and Grace, they meet basically at like an opera show.
Yeah, at one of
his dad's shows. And she would go and make sure she kind of sat in the front row to make sure that, like, hey, he saw her.
Yeah. Real quick, too, I think we need to distinguish the sort of opera that Bruce's father performed, because it wasn't, if you're not familiar with, if you're only familiar with Western opera,
this is not Phantom of the Opera.
Very different
type stuff. This is Chinese opera. I've seen Chinese operas, but I don't even really know how to describe it. I mean, there's a whole cultural tradition behind Chinese operas, and they're different from different regions of China. Like a Beijing opera is different from an opera from Sichuan.
Sure.
So that actual region, like that place, like I'm not sure what the opera looked like, but I'm sure it still had a lot of those characteristics of like there's certain characters, right? There's the scholar,
yeah,
the warrior, and they walk a certain way and they present themselves a certain way.
To me, it seems, just from reading Thomas's account, because if I've seen any sort of Chinese opera, I don't remember, but it seems to me that it would more resemble something like almost Western, like slapstick humor and like very over exaggerated, what someone from the West would consider like very over exaggerated, like emotional things. And
yeah, one way that he talks about it, and I think that this is correct to a certain degree, is thinking about it like Western, the silent films.
Yeah.
Where you have those exaggerated movements. Like if you watch the way that a warrior walks in a lot of Chinese operas, like to the Western eye, it looks ridiculous.
Yeah.
It's like a weird march, like, the back's very straight, and then it's like the knee comes up, and then the leg kicks out, and it's like walks. It's very interesting. There's a whole, I mean, every movement is packed with meaning. So it's like, to the untrained eye, it looks
super
very
exaggerated.
Weird. And again, we'll get into this again when we talk about Chinese film, because a lot of the influence came from opera. So these two meet, and they get married, and they move to 218 Nathan Road, Kowloon, Hong Kong. So if you've heard about any kind of place in Hong Kong, you've probably heard the name Kowloon. And they have a son, but the son quickly dies, which culturally in China, it was a bad sign. And typically the second child that you have is supposed to be a daughter. Now, I can't confirm this. I've never heard this point. And obviously China's a big place.
Yeah.
So, a lot of times there's different
There's a lot of nuance.
Right. I mean, I think in a lot of places it's like, listen, we can have as many boys as we can. Great.
Yeah. That's another thing too. And I'm not being critical because I truly have no idea. But Bruce Thomas, the author, makes a lot of, I don't know if I would say sweeping, but he makes a lot of like statements about Chinese culture at large. And,
Yeah.
And I also don't know how like connected to that he actually is. And he might get it. He might have it right. I don't know.
I would say generally being someone who's supposed, I'm going to put my air quotes up, getting a PhD in East Asian history, specifically China, like generally he does okay.
Mm.
I mean, would it pass, say, in like a Chinese history seminar? Like, no. But for the purposes of this,
he ain't writing a book
right,
like that. So.
right. For the purposes of this book, sure. There was a couple of times where I was reading it and I was like, okay. And there was one thing I know for a fact is a factual error that is really important. And again, we'll get to that later in the podcast.
Good, because I actually don't know what you're referring to, so I'm excited to get there.
Oh yeah, we'll talk about it. It's actually a lot of people think that what this thing that supposedly happened or existed. It didn't.
All right.
But it doesn't, negate the point that he's trying to make. So, they have the first child and he dies. Because the second child's supposed to be a daughter, they adopt a daughter. And this is Bruce's older sister. I'm trying to think. That one would be Agnes. So he had an older sister named Agnes, a very
that was
weird name.
Something else I was really curious about was that it was Agnes, and then there was also like some random other, Western names. And I'm wondering if they were actually named that, or if he's referring to them in that way, or what.
He had 4 siblings in total. There was Agnes, Robert, Peter, and Phoebe. Now, they all certainly had Chinese names.
Okay, that's
Cantonese
what I was...
names. I would almost say with 110% certainty that they did. But we also have to remember that Hong Kong, it's Chinese, but it's also English.
Yeah.
So I think that people having these sorts of names was probably fairly common.
Yeah.
So, yeah, like Hong Kong's just one of those interesting places like this. If you were going to be in any part of China and run into a bunch of people that have Chinese names, but also have like some sort of English name, Hong Kong for sure.
Okay.
So they adopt Agnes, but then they also go on this trip of a tour of the United States. And this is on one of these Chinese opera tours. And his dad, Chen, was working for what's known as the Cantonese Opera Company. And I think we still have stuff like this today, like a Chinese opera company will like tour the United States and go from place to place and put on shows. So that's what he was doing. And at this time, Bruce's mother becomes pregnant. Like she's pregnant with him. And she actually delivers Bruce in San Francisco. So obviously in the United States, we have, if you're born here, you're technically, you have access to citizenship.
Yeah. And I didn't realize that you had to like make a claim on that. And I don't know if that's still the same today or if it was just then, but because I know he talks about later when Bruce ends up returning that he had to like lay claim to his citizenship before he turned 18.
I mean, I think that you still have to do that.
Yeah, that was interesting.
I mean, like, I think you'll get, obviously there's potential that things have changed. And you got to remember, like, at this point in time, if you guys don't know, we'd had, a long history of Chinese exclusion in the United States. And I'm not sure if the Exclusion Act had ended by this point in time. I think it actually ended. I don't think it ended at this point because part of the United States alliance with the Republic of China in World War II, part of that caused the end of the Chinese Exclusion Act. But they were probably able to come to the States because they were coming from Hong Kong. So they were technically
like British
subjects and not Chinese.
See, again, Melvin, imperialism.
History.
Hell,
that
wouldn't have been able to be there if it weren't for the British.
The positives of imperialism. So while they're there, they deliver Bruce in San Francisco. He was born on November 27th, 1940.
Wasn't his dad like in New York at the time too?
Well, yeah, his dad moves on. So basically his dad's like, well, I can't stay here. I've got to go with the troop and keep going. And so his dad's
having this baby.
His dad's in New York while he's delivered in San Francisco. Born on November 27th, 1940, which, if you remember, is the year of the dragon. And according to Bruce Thomas, between 6 and 8 a.m., which is the hour of the dragon.
There you go.
I've never heard about that, but, Bruce Thomas knows.
We'll just call it fact.
And initially, when he was born, he was given the name Siphon, which means small phoenix.
Which is a cool name.
It's a cool name, but it's also a girl's name.
It's still a cool name.
Which I think in the Mandarin would just be like Xiaofeng, which sounds kind of similar.
Yeah.
But yeah, so he was given a girl's name. And the reason he was given a girl's name was because, I mean, these are people, there are cultural superstitions there. And they thought that, maybe if we give him a girl's name and they pierce his ear, that any sort of bad spirits or things like that would be confused or warded off. Which, one thing that's interesting is this sort of kind of idea is present in the 1990s film about Bruce called Dragon. And this is one thing that Thomas criticizes about the film, but
reinforces in his own book.
But yeah, this part kind of reinforces that. Like, obviously the film went way above and beyond with it, but it's like, let's not act like it's completely ridiculous because, these people
were actually superstitious.
To some degree, they felt a little superstitious about
One
this.
thing that I would be really curious about, and one thing that Thomas doesn't write about in this book, and I wouldn't necessarily expect him to, but I'm really curious about Grace's parents and like how culturally German was she?
I don't know, man.
You know what I mean? Like, I wonder if these superstitions were actually hers, or if like she was going. I mean, I legitimately don't know. Like, would she have carried these, quote unquote, like traditional Chinese superstitions, or like was she just going with it for dad's sake, or
Well, I mean, one thing that's interesting is that Grace did live in China. I mean, they were in China. So I mean, if I had to guess, I'd say they leaned a little, heavily Chinese. But I mean, the Westerners that lived in China, it's hard to say because more often than not, they lived in
like separate
in concessions. So there were, when the Western countries went into China, they created all of these concessions along the coast. So you had Tianjin, Shanghai, and obviously Hong Kong became a colony. But there's different places around the coast, and they lived in these foreign concessions, like in Tianjin. And if you go to Shanghai along the Bund, you have all of these old concessions. You can go to the Japanese concession, the Italian concession, and so on and so forth. And, so it's possible that they could have lived within kind of their own little world, but it's also possible that they didn't. And I think the fact that he had a Chinese wife maybe indicates that maybe they didn't. I mean, it's hard to say. I mean, it's hard to say even to what extent, based on the account that's in Bruce's book, Bruce Thomas, that is, we don't know what sort of role her grandfather played. Like,
I mean, we really don't. We don't know anything much about Grace past the fact that she was German, German and Chinese, and then a little bit. I mean, like, he talks about sort of like parenting and like that sort of stuff, but in terms of like her past or like her personality, it's really not there. Yeah.
So Bruce is born in San Francisco, and he got the name Bruce kind of at birth. Like the doctor. Obviously, the doctor.
This little baby looks like a Bruce.
This is at Jackson Street Hospital in San Francisco. And Bruce Thomas actually mentions the doctor by name, and I did not take note of the doctor's name. But she just takes to calling him Bruce, and the name stuck because obviously she's like, I'm not calling this kid Saipan.
Right, but he was also renamed too.
He was.
It's Jun Fan, isn't it?
Yeah.
Which the author says means return again because Grace, allegedly believed that he would one day come back to the United States and or San Francisco.
Yep. But one thing that's interesting, though, is like in China, like we don't typically refer to Bruce Lee that way.
Yeah, I'd never heard of that before, but apparently his schools were called, Junfan, Jikundu or whatever institute.
Well, I mean, I've heard of that, but like Chinese people, they call him Li Xiaolong, which it just means like little dragon.
Okay.
So like, I mean, a lot of, for me, it was like, that's his name. Like we never call him like Junfan. But that also could be that that's Cantonese. But they would have had the manner and pronunciation of his name anyway.
This is kind of an aside too, but I thought it was interesting about, Bruce being born in the year of the dragon and
the hour of the dragon.
Yeah, well, like all that stuff. And I actually just recently listened to another podcast. I forget which one it is, but it was about people born in the year of the dragon and how like they are considered to be exceptional in a lot of ways. And the researcher who was talking on the podcast was actually curious about whether or not that is kind of like a self-fulfilling prophecy that like because people are born in the year of the dragon, they are sort of pushed towards being exceptional from the beginning.
Here's what I would say is that if you actually look at all the exceptional people in the world, right?
Mm-hmm. They're all born at the year of the dragon.
No, there's an exceptional person born in every year.
Yeah. Well, they were talking about Chinese specifically.
Right, but this is the same thing. Like there's exceptional people in China that we probably don't hear about here.
Exceptional was probably the wrong word, but like
special people.
Yeah, or like higher achieving people even.
But I would bet you that if you, let's say you shifted that to like the year of the dog, you would find the same thing.
You're probably right.
Right? Especially when you look, the longer you look, the more likely you are to find more and more people, right?
Yeah.
And China's got
a lot of people.
5,000 years of history that you can pick through. So, I mean, I think that the self-fulfilling prophecy is that if you look within this band, you will find something.
Yeah.
If you ask me. So, yeah, Bruce is born. It's 1940. Obviously, for those of you who don't know, World War II is about to jump off, and Bruce was born 1 year before the United States would enter the war.
Yeah.
But in mainland China, things are already going bad because, they're fighting the Japanese.
Yeah.
But not in Hong Kong, not yet.
Not
So,
yet.
Eric, why don't you tell us about Bruce's family and early acting career?
Yeah, I thought this was really interesting too because, again, like I know very little about Hong Kong outside of the very sparse reading that I've done. But the way he describes Hong Kong, it gave me like the feeling of what you might think of the Wild West and like American Westerns and stuff like that, that it was just a tough place. There was a lot of unemployment. There was a lot of people fleeing different parts of China and stuff like that into Hong Kong. And it was like a lot of homelessness, a lot of unemployment. And so it was just like a very, I don't know if tough is the right word, but it was kind of there was a lot of challenges in growing up in Hong Kong. You saw a lot of stuff that you don't, your average child growing up in 2018 United States probably isn't going to see.
So yeah, he definitely gives the picture like the mean streets of Hong Kong.
Yeah.
So for those of you who don't know, like Hong Kong is British colony, like we said, but in 1949, mainland China becomes communist. And people that were struggling in mainland China would often try to book over to Hong Kong and get a good taste of that capitalism. And obviously, when you have this influx of people that don't have a lot of money or know anyone
Or
really
any
with
money.
like they get there and they struggle in the city and they can be taken advantage of.
Yeah.
But also, Hong Kong is not like Hong Kong in the 1950s is not Hong Kong today.
Right.
It's more up and coming. People are working hard, long jobs. It's crowded. I mean, it's still crowded today, but it was not the $1 billion metropolis that it is today or $1 trillion metropolis. Like, it was kind of a rough place. And a lot of people, they spent their days, like kids, they spent their days fighting on the streets,
Dude,
man.
a lot of street gangs. A lot of street gangs run by little kids, but we'll get there.
We'll get there.
The thing, though, that I wanted to touch on real quick was, so that's sort of like the setting of Bruce's childhood. But at the time, and I also thought this was interesting too, was that the Lee family was not wealthy, but they were considered by Hong Kong standards at the time to be like upper middle class. Bruce's dad didn't make a ton of money, but he had a good living and it was consistent, which is a lot more than a lot of people could say.
Yeah, and you think about like he was an actor.
Yeah.
Like when you're making money acting, life is rough, but it ain't that bad. But also, it's not acting like you think of acting today.
Yeah.
Like the Chinese had a very different acting context. You got paid very little. You signed on to these long, these contracts and, you maybe get X amount for X amount of shows. And you weren't going to live great, but his dad was established enough that, he was doing good. They had a decent apartment.
Yeah, but it was still like a small apartment from the description.
Mm-hmm.
And what really struck me was that these people who were considered upper middle class, the amount of people that were squeezed into
the
that
apartment.
I think he said at one point after Bruce's uncle's wife died.
Yeah.
Or no, Bruce's uncle died. And his wife came in and her children moved in with them. There was up to like 20 people living in that place.
And it was like one bathroom and
because like when it was like
3 dogs.
Yeah. And a chicken. He goes out of his way to mention the chicken.
Yeah. No AC.
No AC. And what was crazy too was they were saying that during droughts, they would just fill that bathtub up and all 20 people in the chicken used it.
Yeah. I mean, some of us, you think about like our parents' childhood growing up, you just cram people in. My mother had 10 siblings and they had a 2 or 3 bedroom house with 1 bathroom.
Yeah.
It's not big. Half of it could fit in this room we're sitting in right now.
Yeah, now double that number and shrink the house.
And my mom used to always say, you get in where you fit in. If there's a bathtub with some water in it, that's how you got to do it. But yeah, no, and I think that they were fortunate to have that roof that everybody could kind of come under. And that was, you said, more than a lot of people had.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like listeners in the West are probably like, man, that would be awful. But like at the time, like that was great.
Yeah, I'm at the point now in life where I'm like, man, I'm not trying to share a bathroom with nobody except my wife.
I make Aaron use a different bathroom. So that was kind of the context of Bruce's upbringing, in this upper middle class family in Hong Kong. It was like kind of rough and tumble by the author's description. But Bruce, he started out acting very young. And, a lot had to do with the fact that his father was in the business. And now he was in films too, relatively young, even though I don't believe his father did film though, did he? Or do you know? Or
he may have done some films. I'm not sure.
Okay, but Bruce was a child actor. And some of the films, the first one he ever did was, it was called Golden Gate Girl. This is when he was a baby and he was just
literally just a prop.
He was cast as the prop baby.
This may have been a film that his dad was in.
Okay. I think you're right. I'm pretty sure he does actually mention that. But then, he was in another one called The Birth of Manking, and he was just, a street urchin.
Is it man? It may have been Mankind. I may have written that wrong.
Wow.
But it may be The Birth of Mankind.
The Birth of Mankind.
Who knows? Man King or Mankind? Listeners out there, you can look it up.
Use the Google, friends. And then he also, in a couple other films too, and early on, he usually was cast as like the street urchin or something like that.
Which is perfect because
that's what he was.
He was just like one of those kids that was like out on the street getting into fights every day.
Yeah, and I don't know if we've mentioned the tension, but I feel like it's probably not hard to discern that there was often tension between groups of Chinese students and British students. He attended LaSalle College, which would it be a high school, middle school, like by
by his age, it would have been like a middle school type thing.
Yeah, but it certainly wasn't a university or.
But obviously, the system is different there. So what we call a middle school might be a high school.
Sure.
So.
I understand he was young. He was adolescent when he attended LaSalle. And this was a Catholic school with mostly Chinese students. And there was a lot of anti-British sentiment among him and his peers. And so, what do you do when you have a lot of anti-British sentiment? You form a street gang. I know that's
anti-British street gang.
That's right. I know that's what I would do.
In the school, so they had a British school not very far away that was called King George V. And
hate him.
So my buddy came back from China and he brings me these DVDs of like straight Bruce Lee, his life story. They had 2 or 3 seasons long.
There's one on Netflix. It was probably the same thing you're talking about.
Is it in Chinese?
Yeah, it's in Chinese and it's like 50 episodes long.
Okay, yeah. It's probably the same one. It's relatively new, like within the last like 5 years.
Yeah. I bet it's the exact same one.
And I'm watching it and there's these scenes where he's in like high school and he's like...
First episode, is he doing like the cha-cha for his high school? Yeah. I guarantee it's the same
He hates these British dudes. He's saying all this like hyper-patriotic stuff like, we Chinese are not the sick men of Asia. And he like punches the British guy in the face. And I'm like, man, this is just crazy.
Bruce Lee, big time nationalist.
Read the documentary. I'm like, oh, this actually is true. He was out there scrapping with British dudes.
He really did not like the British.
Yeah. And if you don't know, so obviously Hong Kong colony at the time, Chinese, not necessarily huge fans of the British at the time. And this was immediately post-war, right? So World War II ends in 1945. We're talking about Hong Kong in the 1950s. And I don't know who they hated more. I suspect that obviously they hated the Japanese more than the British because, the Japanese also invaded Hong Kong during the war and the occupation there wasn't fun. So those are like the two groups, man. It's like if you're British or Japanese, to some degree, you're on the hyper-patriotic, we just dislike you list in China.
Yeah.
And Bruce apparently spent some of those younger years just fighting with British dudes.
Yeah, and like the thing too was that when we say he had a street gang, which is what I was about to say, at the time he had a street gang, it didn't necessarily fit my idea of like a street gang. They were really, and it's described as someone who knew Bruce in his youth as like 8 dudes that went around and fought any British guys they could find.
Yeah.
And it was like, they called themselves the Junction Street Tigers, which is a pretty cool name. They were also like 14.
It's not a South Side Chicago, like it's not like South Chicago street gang. Right, because obviously in Hong Kong, they don't have guns. I mean,
that's a good point with like that we should mention. They did not have guns.
And I mean, actually, they said like Bruce at this time, he takes to carrying a knife.
Yeah, but
a toilet chain.
I didn't get the impression that he used it often. I think it was more like
I don't think
brandishing. I don't think he was out here
knifing people. You know what I mean? Like,
what if he was? What if he'd actually shanked a bunch of British kids?
Probably, like he left like a trail of blood in his path. Like he carved a trail of blood through Hong Kong. The night shanker. I don't know.
The night shanker. But also, Bruce was not, especially now, people think of Bruce as this like untouchable warrior. And he was at a time, but not at this time in his life. He was, he's getting his behind handed to him because he was a small kid. And Bruce Thomas.
Really small.
Yeah, small. And also he's described as sickly. So he was a small, like skinny kid, pick and fight these British guys who were
also, a lot of them older than him.
Older and generally described as like larger physically. So he's taking his licks, but that didn't stop him. And, he got in a lot of trouble for fighting and also just for not being a good student.
He just wasn't into school, man.
No, and the thing is like from an early age, obviously Bruce Lee becomes very well read and is considered to be like very intelligent. If you ever read anything that he wrote or ever heard him speak or anything like that, like he's obviously not a dumb guy, but he just was not interested in learning what the teachers were trying to teach him. But from a young age, a voracious reader. Yeah,
so actually he gets into so much trouble that he ends up getting expelled from LaSalle College, and he ends up in a different Catholic school. It kind of bounces around a little bit and ends up in St. Francis Xavier College, which I think worked out a little bit better for him. There was one teacher that helped him channel his kind of energies into more.
Yeah, like it sounded to me like he improved a little, but not by a
Not
lot.
a ton. He still didn't like school.
And also, wasn't there an exam that he like didn't have to take by attending St. Francis or something like that?
I'm not sure. Obviously,
I got the impression that more or less his parents were paying for him to kind of like continue.
Yeah, I mean, they're paying for him to go to these schools, and I think that in Hong Kong, typically at this time, there was a free education up to a certain point, and then after that, you had to like test into like the 8th grade and then go. I think he made it past that, and he continued his education because his parents, like, that's what they wanted him to do.
Yeah.
He just wasn't that interested.
And from a young age, he would just skip school all the time.
All the time.
All the time.
His mother's paying all this money.
Yeah, and it was funny because like his mom at one point just sort of gave up, and she was like, "Just tell me when you're going to skip, so I at least know where you're at."
Right. So he's skipping school, and actually, by the time he gets to Xavier College, I think Bruce Thomas talks about how like he's not even doing his own work.
No, he's like intimidating other people into doing his work for him.
Right. He's got these other people just like
bunch of nerds working for him.
Right. Man, this seems to be like a running theme with some of the people that we deal with in our podcast. Just like wasn't super into school initially.
No. So kids, if you want to be remembered by history, don't be into school.
So, one other thing that's kind of interesting is like we were saying, once he gets to St. Francis Xavier, he kind of gets channeled into some more, one teacher channels him into kind of more meaningful or I guess useful activities. But as Arif was saying, he was a smaller kid and he was kind of getting beat up a lot. And his sister, Agnes, talks about how if he got beat in a fight, like he just couldn't deal with it.
Not a great loser.
And at this point in time, like he's not training in any sort of martial arts.
No, and that's something else that I didn't mention before. We talked about that, there's a lot of street gangs and that sort of stuff like that in Hong Kong, but a lot of times they were tied to neighborhoods, but also to martial arts schools. And so at the time, this was, everyone knows what Kung Fu is, or at least has some conception in their own mind of Kung Fu.
In Hong Kong.
Well, I mean now. In 2018
today.
in the United States, but that was not the case then. This was a strictly Chinese practice, and like there was a big culture of not letting anyone who wasn't Chinese learn it. And so like Bruce wanted to learn it because I believe at the time there had been films with a particular actor that portrayed that kind of
the martial sort of martial virtue.
Yeah, and it like popularized Kung Fu even more in China than it had been traditionally.
Well, I mean, Kung Fu had occupied a very important place in China, and up north they call, in Mandarin country, we call it Kung Fu. But like it held an important position, and there were all different kinds of styles of Kung Fu. They emphasized different things. So obviously in Hong Kong, where Bruce was studying, he eventually comes to study an art called Wing-Chun. And then
but I believe what I was talking about was that Lee had become like super into Kung Fu from seeing the films of, I think it was Wang Fei Hung. And that's where he, at first, because, he's getting his behind kicked by all these dudes, and he's seeing this actor on film do a form of martial arts that is defeating other forms of martial arts. And so that's when he starts becoming more and more interested in actually learning.
Yeah, like there's a cultural context there where, so Thomas alludes to the fact that these films were going on. Mm-hmm. He doesn't necessarily directly say that this influenced Bruce. He says like it's hard to imagine that he wasn't influenced by these.
Correct.
And
because they were huge.
They were huge. And that's the thing is like this was all already big in China. So you had films that popularized it, but also people were aware of all of these different martial arts styles. And for a long time in China, there had been these sort of competitions, right, that are going on between different schools. And they're all vying for students and prestige. They emphasize different things. Like some of the northern styles had these really fancy kicking techniques. And it's like, okay, well, how practical is that? And then in certain styles like Wing-Chun, it was much more streamlined. Wing-Chun, like there's very few kicks above the waist. It's built around a straight line. The idea is like the straight line to the target, not a lot of looping punches. It's
no giant haymaker right hooks.
Right. So like they all emphasize different things. And that's kind of what was like beautiful about that time was you had all of these different styles. They were very segmented. Like you didn't have a lot of borrowing from this style and that style. It was like, no, my master does Wing Chun and it's the best.
And it is the greatest.
So Bruce, after getting his butt kicked, one day is like, I need to start studying martial arts.
Yeah.
And what he gets turned on to, like his father practiced Tai Chi.
Which a lot of you are probably thinking Tai Chi in terms of just like the very passive forms of just like flowing movements. But there is a, quote unquote, like martial form of Tai Chi. And they actually still practice it in competition today. It's called push hands.
Yeah, they do
in the
push
West.
hands,
But
which is also in Wing-Chun they do
Yeah.
push hands. But yeah, I mean Tai Chi, it's a very right now today it's a soft art, right? But I
Yeah.
mean before it was initially devised as a martial art, but after centuries, it became kind of what it is today, and it's mostly helps old people keep their bones.
that's right. You got to stay
lubricated.
limber. Stay limber.
Yeah, I mean I did a summer of Tai Chi when I was living in Southwest China, and it was great. But I wouldn't try to fight anybody with
Did
it
you feel
right now.
limber?
I did.
That's what matters.
So his father practiced Tai Chi, and Bruce was like, no, that's not going to work.
Dad, I'm getting my butt kicked with your martial arts.
Right. So he decides, I need to learn Wing Chun because he had heard about its effectiveness versus other martial arts styles. So he had to seek out a Wing Chun teacher. So Bruce started practicing with a martial arts master in the area named Yip Man.
Is it Yip?
I mean, that's how I say it.
Because, obviously that's how it's spelled in the book, but
Mhm.
there's also a popular movie franchise about him. And
how do they
it's
pronounce it in the movie?
Ip. They just say Ip.
Oh,
and it's
yeah,
only,
yeah.
And it's just
Ip.
spelled Ip. Like IP.
IP?
Yeah.
Yeah, because they call him IP Man. No, I mean,
Do
it's
they really?
some people do. IP Man.
Well, those people are wrong.
Yeah, you can say Ip. I mean,
I don't
sometimes I say Yip, but
We'll say Yip.
it's not all that.
We're going to
important.
say Yip.
I
because
don't speak Cantonese, so I have no. I don't feel bad about it.
We're going to say Yip.
Yeah, so Ip Man is the local teacher, and I feel like he was fairly exclusive, but because Bruce was
I think he was 13 when he started.
13 when he started.
He had continued his career in film. And again, he wasn't like Macaulay Culkin as a child actor, but he was a known actor, and he had a little bit of a reputation around him. So Yip Man was excited to take him on. He was like, "Ooh, celebrity!"
Happy to take him on, and Bruce, he took to the learning. He learned it very quickly, and he studied very hard.
And it was also under Yip Man that he started doing there's all those famous pictures of him hitting the wooden dummy, and that was introduced to him here too, wasn't it?
The training dummy?
Yeah.
No, the Wing Chun training dummy it's just a part of Wing Chun.
But I mean, that's where
development.
Bruce would have encountered it first.
Oh, and yeah. I thought you meant here as in the United States.
Oh no. I meant with Yip Man.
That's one thing that they practice on. So if you've never seen it, it's a wooden dummy. Imagine a log with a bunch of little logs around it that stick out that represent arms and a leg. And, you train on it. You train on throwing different strikes and parrying, because a lot of it is you parry and you strike at the same time. So it's about developing that. If you've ever seen the movie Dragon, you'll see it. And if you've ever seen Jackie Chan's Rumble in the Bronx, you'll see it in the beginning of that. Yeah, so I mean, he trained and he became very good.
And my understanding too was that he also had some frustrations with training because he wanted to jump to that stuff right away. And,
very impetuous.
And Yip Man was trying to rein him in. And Yip Man's son trained with Bruce there, and he remembers him. He's quoted in the book as remembering him as always fighting super angry and crazy and super aggressive. And Yip Man was trying to get him to calm down and focus on different technique and that sort of stuff. But Bruce, he had a one-track mind, and it's something that he continue into adulthood where he's just no, I want the functionality. I don't care about this stuff. Teach me how I can go beat up these British kids better.
And he also Bruce had a really bad temper, which, obviously when we create these icons, right, we put them on a pedestal, but Bruce's temper was insane, which is one thing that we'll get into later. But when he's doing push hands, if a guy slips in a punch, man, and gets him, he's mad, man.
Yeah.
And, Ip Man was trying to tell him dude, this isn't helping you. You need to be able to stay focused and focus on what you're doing. So that was a problem for Bruce, but
he absolutely dove headfirst into it. He talks about, he being the author, about how Bruce would just all the time, he was finding some way to practice kung fu. He was a kid who never stood still to begin with, but now his not standing still was because he was finding a tree to go kick or something like that. And it's funny because a long time ago, and we should probably at some point cover, I would like to anyway, I read a biography of Pistol Pete Maravich, and for those of you who don't know, legendary basketball player in the United States. But he, as a kid, would walk around and he constantly had a basketball, constantly in his hand, and that's the impression I get about this. Bruce was always incorporating kung fu, or what I mean. No matter what he was doing, he was always finding a way to get better at.
There's something to that, but and I'll let Arif tell you about this. He kind of runs into some problems at Ip Man's school, and it has nothing to do with really him. It's It's a bigger issue.
It's his ancestry. We kind of alluded to it before, but this was a time when practitioners of different styles of Kung Fu and traditional Chinese martial arts didn't want this to get out and didn't want it to be taught to people who weren't Chinese. And when someone found out that Bruce's grandfather was German, they didn't think that he should be taught anymore. And, they tried to convince Yip Man not to teach him. And, Yip Man was still going to teach him, but soon people stopped partnering with Bruce and that sort of thing. And so he left of his own volition and actually started training with one of Yip Man's more senior students.
Yeah.
And I believe the exchange was that, we haven't mentioned this, but Bruce was also a cha-cha champion.
Real good.
And the exchange was that Bruce would teach him to dance if he would continue to teach him Kung Fu.
Yeah, that was the workaround. Was like, I think it got to the point where it was kind of untenable for him to stay at Yip Man's school.
Yeah, from the book, he didn't have sparring partners. Like, people were just like, nah, I'm good, man.
And that's the thing, too, is like, I mean, and this will come up later, like, Yip was also pretty conservative.
Oh, yeah,
like,
for
in
sure.
terms of his approach to, like, the martial arts. Like, I think he was probably like, I like Bruce. I'd probably keep teaching him. But he was probably like, these guys have a good point. You know? His grandfather was German. So, I mean, the workaround was that he would just train kind of privately and secretly with one of Yip Man's best students.
But, soon after this whole thing happened, he continued to fight with people outside of a gym. He's still fighting these British guys and kind of anyone who he felt either actually issued a challenge or he just
looked at him wrong.
Yeah, pretty much. Like, again, he was a super angry guy. And so he was just kind of one of those people who's always looking for a fight. In 1958, he competed in a boxing tournament.
Which was at this, I think it was kind of like run through the schools, like the school system.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what I was saying, where the teacher at St. Francis Xavier, he's the one that's like, Bruce, you should enter the boxing tournament. And Bruce like breezed through the early competition. But there was this one kid, British kid, who was probably from King George V or whatever.
Man.
He was like the 3-time champion. And I think he was older than Bruce.
Yeah, he was.
And Bruce, had to fight him in the final round. And from Bruce Thomas's account, the first round did not go well for Bruce.
No.
But I think they said he scored like a 3rd round knockout and became the champion.
Yeah.
And I think that same year or the year immediately following, he became like the Hong Kong Cha-Cha champion too.
Yeah. Bruce out here winning, just not in school where he's still a terrible student.
So, I mean, things kind of, in terms of that, like he's just fighting all the time.
And reading voraciously, just not school related. And so his parents were like,
hold on, before we even get to that, like we should talk about the fact that some of these fights, like if you've read anything about Bruce or maybe seen some of the movies about his life, he has a famous, like, I don't know why it's so, like this one fight is picked out, but like he has this famous fight on the rooftop of
it sounds cool as heck. That's why.
Yeah, a Hong Kong building where 2 of these like martial arts practitioners meet on the roof and do battle. And Bruce ends up, defeating this guy. And, and at this time, he's still in school, but it just gets to the point where it's like, this just isn't going to work. Like, he's fighting all the time. He's kind of in these, like, street gangs. And his parents just are like, we got to do something about this.
His parents are like, Bruce, it's real easy to become homeless and degenerate in Hong Kong right now. And you don't seem like you're on the education track. So, you could go claim your citizenship in the U.S., try to do school over there. And so that's what he elects to do.
Yeah, I mean, his mom was like, she was legit worried like he was just going to get killed.
Yeah.
On the streets of Hong Kong.
Yeah, and so right after winning the Cha-Cha Championship, Bruce decides that he's off to the United States, and I think we should wrap with Bruce going to the United States. But I just want to get this in real quick. I'm thinking in my mind, like, when I'm reading this, like, would suck to fly. But he sailed. This was a 3-week voyage.
This was way before, before you typically would just, like, fly.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
One interesting thing to note, too, before we wrap is he didn't just leave, right? So he had to do all this stuff, apply to all this stuff to get out of Hong Kong. And that's when he discovers him and his buddy, who we haven't talked about yet, but his best friend when he was a child was a fellow child actor that they called a unicorn. And him and his buddy find out that they're like on a street gang watch list. And the like authorities are like, no, you can't go anywhere. Like you're
a terrorist.
Yeah, like you're a gang member. Imagine like one of our gang watch lists, and it's got like Bruce Lee and a dude named, and they call it Unicorn.
The Unicorn.
So they're on this watch list and like they have to clear his name before he can leave, which
funny.
In this case means paying a bribe to the authorities and finally being able to sail to the U.S. But again, like Arif said, he had to take a 3-week boat ride, which he spent most of the time training
I thought it was funny that he booked passage in
like the worst cabin.
The worst cabin, but he spent a lot of time in first class because he, was like, hey, I'll teach you cha-cha.
Right.
Let me have some of your food.
So he's teaching these people and he's sailing across the U.S. Because at this time, like, I don't think we even established flights going to Hawaii until like the mid to late 1950s. So like for a regular kid from Hong Kong, the way you get to the U.S. is
a boat.
And it was probably rough.
Yeah.
So we'll pick up from there when we come back. Thanks for tuning into the first episode.
Yeah, we'll see you next week.
Hey, before we take off, I just want to remind you guys how you can support the show. First, you can rate, review, and tell a friend, and also follow us on social media.
Especially Twitter. We're at the Life of X Podcast. Additionally, you can head over to lifeofxpodcast.com/support, where you will find portals to audible.com, amazon.com, and patreon.com. For those of you who are unfamiliar, Audible is a gigantic and wonderful audiobook website. You can receive a free audiobook when you sign up through our website. You go through our Amazon portal. Any purchases that you make, Amazon kicks us a small percentage of that. And finally, you can head over to our Patreon page where you can sign up to make a contribution to the show on a per episode basis. We appreciate your support.